June 22nd, 1944. Near the French village of St. Lo. The rain had finally stopped, but the fields still reeked of mud and diesel. American trucks rolled through the countryside, headlights hooded, engines rumbling under gray skies. At first glance, it looked like a typical armored convoy. M4 Shermans, half-tracks, and jeeps stretching down the road in disciplined formation. But if you stood close enough, you'd notice something strange. The tanks sagged when the wind blew. Sergeant Fred Fox crouched beside one of the tanks, gripping a small air pump. He gave it a few more strokes, watching the rubber hull take shape under the camouflage netting. "You think Jerry's going to buy this one?" he muttered. Private Arthur Shilstone, a painter from Connecticut before the war, smirked and flicked a cigarette butt into the mud. "From a mile away? He'll think Patton himself just rolled in." Behind them, sound engineers were stringing wires through the hedgerows, setting up massive speakers hidden under tarps. The cables ran back to a truck marked 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Inside, a team of men in headphones adjusted the dials of a reel-to-reel recorder. A low mechanical growl began to hum through the speakers. The sound of armored engines, perfectly synchronized to the illusion outside. To the Germans, aerial reconnaissance would soon report an entire armored division assembling on this sector of the front. But in truth, only about 1,100 men were there. Artists, actors, and engineers, playing the most dangerous game of make-believe in the history of modern warfare. They called themselves the Ghost Army. 2 weeks earlier, the real divisions of the U.S. Army had broken out from Normandy after D-Day. Hitler's generals scrambled to predict where the next thrust would come. The Americans wanted to keep them guessing. That's when the Ghost Army was unleashed. Officially designated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the unit was unlike any other in the U.S. military. Its soldiers weren't chosen for marksmanship or bravery, but for creativity. Many came from art schools, advertising agencies, and Hollywood sound studios. Their mission wasn't to fight. It was to deceive. They were equipped not with heavy artillery, but with inflatable tanks made of rubberized canvas, dummy aircraft, fake radio chatter, and mobile sound systems that could project the noise of a moving armored column for miles. The idea was simple. If they could make the enemy believe a major force was massing in one area, the real divisions could slip through somewhere else. Their work began in the hedgerows of Normandy, where deception meant survival. In the weeks following D-Day, the Germans had shifted panzer divisions to crush the Allied advance. The Ghost Army's task was to divert those reinforcements, to make the Germans commit tanks and troops to ghostly armies that didn't exist. Night fell over St. Lo. A faint orange glow flickered on the horizon. Artillery fire from the front lines. Fox and Shilstone stood on the edge of the camp, watching a pair of engineers drape a camouflage net over a row of half-tracks. They looked convincing, especially in the dim light. Nearby, the sound truck roared to life, broadcasting the rumble of engines and the clatter of treads. The noise echoed off the hills, convincing even the American infantry nearby that an armored battalion was moving through. "Hell," Shilstone whispered. "If I didn't know better, I'd start digging foxholes." Fox grinned. "That's the point." A jeep pulled up, spattering mud on their boots. Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Ingersoll, one of the operation planners, leaned out. "All right, boys, lights up in 20. Let's make this division look alive." Within minutes, teams fanned out with lanterns and flashlights. They moved in rhythmic patterns through the darkness, mimicking the nighttime bustle of a full division preparing for battle. To an observer miles away, the field shimmered with the illusion of life. hundreds of flickering lights where there were only a few dozen men. Overhead, German reconnaissance planes droned faintly. The photographers aboard would return to their superiors with pictures showing a formidable American force. In the war rooms of the Wehrmacht, pins would move on maps. Entire German units would be redirected to confront a phantom, and the real 4th Armored Division, miles to the south, would slip through unopposed. By dawn, the men were already deflating the tanks, rolling up canvas, and coiling wires. Within hours, the entire division would vanish, leaving behind only muddy tire tracks. The operation, like a magician's trick, was complete before the audience even realized it had begun. Private Shilstone wiped the sweat from his brow. "We just fought a battle," he said, without firing a single shot. Fox nodded. "Yeah, but if we screw this up, someone else will pay the price." Because unlike most illusions, this one was staged in the middle of a war zone. If the Germans ever caught on, if they ever sent a real artillery barrage against a fake tank park, there would be nowhere to hide. For now, though, their deception had worked perfectly. The Germans took the bait, and somewhere, Hitler's generals were planning their next move against an army that did not exist. July 1944. Somewhere outside Rennes, France, a convoy of trucks rolled into a deserted orchard. The engine sputtered to a halt, and men in dusty uniforms climbed down, stretching stiff limbs. They didn't look like typical soldiers. Some carried sketchbooks, others hauled wooden crates labeled "sound equipment fragile." In the distance, the rumble of artillery grew louder. But for these men, the real battlefield was invisible. Captain George Reb gathered the platoon under the shade of a broken apple tree. His voice was calm but sharp. "Gentlemen, we're about to convince the Germans that the 9th Army is moving north. The real 9th is 80 miles away. That means we have to make them see what isn't there." He pointed to a map spread across a Jeep hood. "Our front stretches along this road here. 3 miles. We'll deploy 30 dummy tanks, set up decoy command posts, and broadcast armored movement all night. Every gun they point at us is one they're not pointing at the real boys up north." A low chuckle rippled through the group. Someone muttered, "So we're bait." Reeb looked up. "That's exactly what we are." The Ghost Army had been created for this purpose, to act as bait that bleeds sound and shadow instead of blood. Their unit drew from the best creative minds America had to offer. Some were fashion designers. Others had worked at Walt Disney Studios or in Madison Avenue ad firms. One, Bill Blass, would later become a world-famous clothing designer. Another, Ellsworth Kelly, would go on to become a celebrated abstract painter. But here, under the French sun, their canvas was mud and fear. The men unpacked rolls of rubber tanks from their trucks, dragging them into position. They inflated the hulking shapes with air compressors that coughed and hissed like steam engines. Slowly, Sherman tanks seemed to rise from the earth itself. Dozens of them, aligned with mathematical precision. Nearby, a group of engineers began laying down strips of tire tread. Not real tracks, but imprints made by dragging patterned molds across the soil. From the sky, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot would see what looked like a heavy armored column. Meanwhile, inside a sound truck, Sergeant Harold Dahl and his team prepared a different kind of weapon. On a table lay several reels labeled M4, Tank Column, Gravel Road, Pontoon Bridge Assembly Night, Truck Convoy 10th Armored. Dahl threaded one into the player, adjusted the volume, and let the speakers roar. The night filled with mechanical thunder. Clanking treads, shouted commands, engines revving. Every minute, he'd change the sequence, varying the distance and intensity to mimic real movement. "We can make a division appear out of thin air," Dahl said, grinning, "and make it disappear just as fast." The deception didn't end with sound and sight. Radio operators played a subtler game, the art of invisible conversation. Lieutenant Jack Macy, a young architecture student before the war, sat inside a tent filled with buzzing radios. His job was to impersonate entire networks of communication. He'd studied the unique quirks of each real division, how their operators signed off, their slang, even their typing rhythms on Morse code. At night, his key clicked furiously. Charlie read to baseplate, request additional fuel for convoy moving east. A pause. Then another operator in the same tent, using a different radio, answered as if from miles away. They created a complete illusion of logistics and chatter that enemy interceptors could triangulate. To German intelligence, the fake division was alive, coordinated, and mobile. Every detail mattered, from the insignia on uniforms to the paint on jeeps. When soldiers went into nearby villages, they wore patches of whichever division they were impersonating that week. They'd drop hints in cafes, letting local spies overhear that the 2nd Armored Division was moving in. Within hours, the rumor would ripple through occupied territory. And back to German command. One careless word could kill hundreds of real men somewhere else. That was the pressure they lived under. That evening, Captain Reb walked the perimeter, inspecting the setup. The orchard was now a surreal gallery of inflatable machinery and illusion. As dusk fell, the silhouettes looked frighteningly real, the soft outlines blending into the fog that rolled across the fields. He paused beside one of the decoy tanks, tapping its side with his boot. The hollow thump echoed. "If Jerry starts shelling, this one's not going to save you," he muttered. Private Shilstone, crouched nearby sketching the scene, looked up. "Doesn't matter, sir, long as it fools him first." Reb smiled faintly. That's the spirit. As night deepened, they switched on their deception. Loudspeakers filled the valley with the roar of armor. From miles away, villagers watched the flicker of lights and mistook it for troop movement. Somewhere across the lines, a Luftwaffe pilot peered down through cloud breaks, radioing coordinates back to base. American Armored Division forming south of Rennes. By dawn, German artillery began to reposition. The illusion was complete, and while the enemy prepared to meet a phantom, the real Ninth Army swept through another corridor, unopposed, unseen. For the men of the Ghost Army, this was victory. But it came with a price, the constant risk of discovery. Because if the Germans ever realized the truth, that the armored division before them was made of rubber and plywood, every man in the 23rd would be wiped out within minutes. August 1944, outside Chartres, France. The heat hung heavy over the wheat fields, carrying the sweet burnt smell of cordite and gasoline. In a hollow between two ridges, a column of Sherman silhouettes glistened in the noon light. They looked battle-ready. But inside each one, you could hear the hiss of air valves rather than the clank of steel. Corporal Bob Tompkins wiped the sweat from his palms and glanced at the horizon. "They're late," he said. Lieutenant Claude Bettman, an art director from Chicago before the war, kept his binoculars fixed on the road. "They'll come, they always do." He wasn't talking about Americans. He was waiting for German spotter planes. Today's show was meant to draw the Luftwaffe's eyes away from a genuine supply crossing 10 miles south. The Ghost Army would stage an elaborate illusion. A mock river crossing complete with pontoon bridges, headlights, and rumbling convoys that existed only as sound. By early afternoon, the men of the 603rd Camouflage Engineer Battalion had transformed the quiet valley into a theater. Inflatable trucks lined the embankment. Sheets of burlap stretched across wooden scaffolds to imitate pontoon segments. Under the bridge, empty fuel drums floated, tethered with rope, catching the sunlight like real steel pontoons. Then the sound crew went to work. Huge amplifiers, some the size of refrigerators, were aimed toward the water. On cue, reels began to spin. The creak of cranes, the splash of oars, shouted commands echoing over metal. Through hidden loudspeakers, the valley erupted with life. German observers couldn't have missed it. Within an hour, artillery from the far ridge answered. Shells whistling overhead, geysers of mud exploding in the shallows. "Christ!" Tompkins shouted, diving behind a mound. Bettman laughed breathlessly. They bought the ticket. When the bombardment finally stopped, the men crawled out to inspect the damage. One of the inflatable trucks had shredded like tissue paper. A single shell would have slaughtered a real platoon. Here, only canvas had died. That night, Reb's team gathered around their mess kits under blackout lanterns. They didn't talk about the close call. They talked about timing, positioning, perspective. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were performance artists measuring brushstrokes in miles and minutes. Private Bob Boyle, who once sketched fashion ads in New York, tapped a pencil against his helmet. "You realize, sir," he said to Reb, "we're basically painting on the land itself." Reb smiled. "Just make sure the painting bleeds loud enough to save lives." Every operation demanded invention. Sometimes they used smoke generators to simulate dust from marching troops. Other times they parked jeeps end to end under camouflage nets to suggest armored columns. In one mission, they even positioned loudspeakers on opposite hillsides to imitate tanks maneuvering in stereo. The first use of surround sound in warfare. The danger wasn't only physical, it was psychological. Deceivers had to stay inside their lies. If captured wearing the wrong insignia, they risked execution as spies. Many carried double dog tags, one real, one fake, and prayed the Germans would never look too closely. Late one evening, as the men prepared to move again, Captain Reb received new orders. The next deception would be their largest yet. Operation Bettenburg. The 23rd would impersonate the entire 6th Armored Division along the Moselle River to draw German fire away from General Patton's real push into Luxembourg. It meant setting up 600 dummy vehicles, fake headquarters, fake supply lines, and doing it all within 24 hours. Reb folded the message and exhaled slowly. "We're going to be the loudest ghosts in Europe," he said. As dawn crept over the valley, the trucks rolled out once again, engines growling through the mist. Behind them lay fields littered with deflated tanks and torn rubber, evidence of a battle that never truly existed. Ahead waited new villages, new illusions, new risks. For the men of the Ghost Army, every movement was a brushstroke in a masterpiece of survival. They were artists fighting not for glory, but for the precious few hours of confusion that could spare another man's life. September 1944. Moselle River Valley, near Bettenburg, Luxembourg. A heavy mist clung to the hills, turning the dawn into a pale watercolor of gray and silver. The Ghost Army convoy wound through narrow country roads, headlights dimmed, their breath hanging like ghosts in the cold air. Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Ingersoll, one of the operation's masterminds, leaned against the hood of a jeep and scanned the map under a red lamp. "This one's going to be delicate," he murmured. "The Krauts are watching every bridge from Metz to Trier. If they think the 6th Armored is massing here, they'll pull tanks from Patton's path." Captain Reb looked up from the mud-slick road. "And if they find out it's just us?" Ingersoll gave a thin smile. "Then the masquerade's over, and we'll be fertilizer by morning." By noon, The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had spread across a 6-mile front along the Moselle. It was an enormous illusion, one that would rival anything the unit had ever attempted. Teams of engineers inflated 300 rubber Shermans and M10 tank destroyers. Each dummy vehicle took 20 minutes to fill with air, hissing and creaking until the shape looked almost lifelike. Artists painted serial numbers and weathering onto the canvas hulls, adding streaks of oil and mud. At the same time, sound trucks were positioned along the ridges. The engineers rolled out reels marked Tank Column Wet Ground, Maintenance Depot, and Bridge Repair 6th Armored. From the valley below came the chorus of motors, shouted orders, and the clang of metal, projected through hidden amplifiers to echo for miles. The deception was staggering in scale. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers handled the visual illusion. The 3132nd Signal Service Company handled sound. The 406th Combat Engineers laid fake roads and bridges. And the 23rd Signal Company generated an entire lattice of fake radio traffic, complete with fabricated logistics reports and command chatter that German intelligence would eagerly intercept. Even the smallest details were forged. Supply trucks drove in loops to create tire marks. Fake command posts were furnished with empty map cases, cigarette butts, and half-eaten rations. So if a German patrol ever stumbled across them, they'd look convincingly abandoned. At dusk, Ingersoll and Reb stood on a bluff overlooking the valley. Below them, the fog rolled across fields dotted with ghost tanks, their silhouettes flickering in the moonlight. "Looks real enough," Reb said. Ingersoll adjusted his binoculars. "It better be. Wehrmacht recon planes have been spotted south of here." As if on cue, the distant hum of an engine grew overhead. The men froze. A German Fiesler Storch reconnaissance aircraft, barely larger than a glider, swept low over the valley. Its camera shutters clicked rapidly, capturing what appeared to be a full American armored division. The deception had taken hold. Hours later, in a bunker near Metz, a German staff officer pored over those photos. "The 6th Armored Division is here," he told his superior. "They're preparing a crossing at Bettemberg." Orders rippled down the chain. Elements of the 11th Panzer Division were redirected north to stop the phantom threat. Patton's real forces, meanwhile, punched through the weakened German line 60 miles south. That night, the Ghost Army encampment came alive. Ingersoll had ordered the men to simulate a full divisional bivouac, complete with glowing cook fires, engine maintenance, and even truck headlights snaking through the hills. Private Bill Blass, covered in grease and dirt, was painting serial numbers on an inflatable Jeep by lantern light. "You know," he said, "somewhere out there are real soldiers sleeping under fire while we're inflating balloons." Arthur Shilstone laughed softly. "Yeah, but if we do this right, maybe they'll wake up alive tomorrow." In a nearby tent, radio operators sent out carefully scripted messages. "Alpha Column reports fuel shortage at grid 3427. Request urgent resupply." Moments later, another operator, playing the role of headquarters, answered, "Resupply convoy en route. ETA 0600. Each line was logged and encrypted, ensuring that German eavesdroppers would believe it genuine. By midnight, the fog thickened. The valley echoed with mechanical life, sounds that came from nowhere. A symphony of deception played in the dark. At 3 a.m., the Germans answered. Artillery fire rained down across the river, shells exploding harmlessly among the rubber tanks. The men hit the ground, covering their heads as air and canvas shredded under shrapnel. When the barrage ended, Sergeant Fred Fox stood up, coughing dust from his throat. "Well," he said hoarsely, "they definitely think we're real." Reeb nodded grimly. "Good. That means Patton's through." For 48 hours, the 23rd held their illusion under fire. By the time they packed up and disappeared into the mist, the Germans were convinced they'd beaten back a major American offensive. In reality, they had wasted 2 precious days and opened the door to Patton's advance into Germany. The Ghost Army's performance had been flawless, and it would only grow bolder from here. November 1944, near the Luxembourg border east of Metz. Snow fell in soft, soundless flakes over the darkened valley. The war had grown colder, quieter, and far deadlier. German artillery had slowed, but only because Hitler was massing his strength for what would soon become the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. The Allies didn't know when or where he would strike, but the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had a new task. Make him guess wrong. The Ghost Army had by now mastered its craft. What began as experimental trickery in Normandy had evolved into a full-scale weapon of psychological warfare. But the stakes had never been higher. Every illusion now stood between the Allies and a potential German counterattack that could cut the entire front in half. Captain George Reb's men arrived at a ruined village outside Metz, a frozen ghost town of shattered roofs and scorched walls. They would transform it overnight into the headquarters of a non-existent American corps. Inside a collapsed farmhouse, Sergeant Harold Dahl unpacked his reels of sound recordings. "We'll make them hear trucks, tanks, bulldozers, like we're building a damn highway," he said, half joking, half weary. "If the Krauts believe this valley's full of engineers, they won't send a single panzer this way." Private Arthur Shilstone looked out the broken window at the barren landscape. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" he said softly. "Building ghosts in a graveyard." By midnight, the sound crews had stretched cables through the rubble, running them to amplifiers hidden in cellars and barns. Soon, the valley pulsed with life that wasn't there. Engines idling, cranes clanking, men shouting over wind. The acoustics of the hills made it all believable. From a distance, it truly sounded like a vast force preparing to move. Meanwhile, the 603rd Camouflage Engineers were hard at work crafting illusions for the morning light. Inflatable tanks were erected in the open fields, their forms stark and menacing against the snow. A few real jeeps drove in looping routes, leaving dozens of tire tracks to enhance the illusion of massed armor. To complete the performance, the 23rd's radio operators flooded the airwaves with chatter. Their transmissions detailed imaginary fuel shortages, bridge repairs, and unit rotations. Each coded line carefully calculated to be accidentally intercepted by German signal intelligence. Up in his observation post, Lieutenant Claude Bettman stared through binoculars at the horizon. The sky glowed faintly orange with distant artillery flashes. "You think they'll buy it?" he asked. Rabe exhaled a plume of steam. "If they don't, we're all corpses by dawn." The deception worked too well. By morning, German spotter planes reported heavy American concentrations north of Metz. Within hours, enemy batteries began shelling the area furiously. The first explosion hit a hillside barely 200 yards from the command truck. Shilstone dove into a ditch as chunks of frozen earth rained down. "They've seen us," he shouted. Reeb crawled over the ridge, peering through smoke. A line of inflatable Shermans had been torn open by shrapnel, their rubber skins flapping like flags. "Let them waste their shells," he said grimly. "Every one of those rounds means another real tank somewhere else is safe." The bombardment continued for hours. By nightfall, the valley was shredded. But the illusion had already succeeded. German divisions diverted south, convinced the Americans were massing for a new offensive. The real armored corps advanced elsewhere with little resistance. When the shelling finally stopped, the men climbed from their foxholes, faces caked in mud and frost. Around them, the army lay in tatters. Punctured tanks, burned sound trucks, shattered props. Fred Fox sat beside a deflated Sherman and lit a cigarette with trembling hands. "Hell of a show," he murmured. "We fooled him again." The Ghost Army's operations became increasingly daring through the winter of 1944. They staged false convoys near Bastogne, phantom artillery in the Ardennes, and fake airfields along the Rhine. Each illusion forced the enemy to disperse, miscalculate, and bleed strength. But the work took its toll. Every man knew that one stray patrol, one captured radio, or one low-flying scout could expose the truth. The 23rd lived constantly in the shadow between performance and annihilation. Sometimes their shows fooled even their own allies. In one instance, an American infantry division moved toward what it thought was a friendly armored column, only to discover rows of rubber tanks and a handful of laughing sound engineers. "We almost called in an airstrike on you idiots," their colonel reportedly shouted. "Don't ever do that again." Yet behind the humor was exhaustion. The men slept little, moved constantly, and carried the weight of knowing their mistakes could kill others. They had no medals for valor, no glory in newspapers. Their victories existed only in silence, in the battles that never happened because of them. By the end of 1944, the Ghost Army had staged more than 20 major deceptions across France, Luxembourg, and Belgium. Each time, they vanished before the enemy realized they'd been tricked. Ingersoll's reports to Schaeff, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, summed it up best. "The 23rd's work has saved countless American lives. The enemy fights phantoms and bleeds for ghosts." Still, there was one last mission to perform, their final and most dangerous act. As 1945 dawned, and the Allies prepared to cross the Rhine into Germany, the Ghost Army would once again step onto the stage, this time under the guns of the Reich itself.